wasn't researching human trafficking when I found the architectural plans. I was investigating basement construction techniques in 19th-century Pacific Northwest cities, trying to understand why so many downtown buildings had unusually deep foundations. Standard urban history research. The kind of thing that fills footnotes in preservation reports without raising questions. But then I discovered blueprints for Portland buildings from the 1850s and 1860s, showing elaborate underground passages connecting structures across multiple city blocks. Not sewers. Not utility tunnels. Finished corridors with proper flooring, lighting provisions, and architectural details that suggested human occupancy. Extensive networks designed for people to move between buildings without ever surfacing. The official story calls them the Shanghai tunnels. According to popular history, these passages were built in the late 1800s to facilitate a brutal practice called Shanghaiing. Sailors would be drugged or knocked unconscious in waterfront bars, dragged through the tunnels, and loaded onto ships bound for Shanghai or other Pacific ports where captains needed crew. It's presented as a dark chapter of Portland's past, a criminal enterprise that exploited the city's underground geography for human trafficking. Tours run through sections of the tunnels today, guides telling stories of trapdoors and holding cells, of desperate men imprisoned underground waiting to be sold into maritime servitude. But that timeline has problems, serious problems that become impossible to ignore when you actually examine the construction evidence. Start with the architecture itself. These aren't crude passages dug by criminals for illicit purposes. They're precisely engineered corridors with brick archways, stone foundations, and construction techniques that match the most sophisticated urban infrastructure of the period. The ceiling heights average 8 to 10 feet. The passages are 6 to 8 feet wide. Drainage systems are integrated into the design. Ventilation shafts connect to the surface at regular intervals. This isn't the work of Shanghaiers hastily creating smuggling routes. This is formal infrastructure, built to specifications, designed for legitimate permanent use. And the dates don't match the Shanghaiing narrative. Building permits and property records show many of these basement connections were constructed in the 1850s and early 1860s, decades before Shanghaiing became prevalent in Pacific ports. The practice really took hold in the 1870s and 1880s, but the tunnels were already there, already connecting buildings, already fully functional as an underground network. Why would someone build elaborate infrastructure decades before it was supposedly needed for criminal enterprise? I found construction documentation from 1852 for a building at First and Morrison. The blueprints clearly show basement-level passages extending in 3 directions, connecting to adjacent properties. The permit application describes them as subterranean commercial corridors, not smuggling routes. Commercial corridors, infrastructure intended for regular business use. Similar records exist for buildings constructed throughout the 1850s. Property surveys show basement passages connecting hotels to warehouses, warehouses to riverside loading areas, commercial buildings to each other in geometric patterns that suggest intentional city planning rather than ad hoc criminal construction. Someone designed this network. Someone approved it. Someone built it as part of Portland's original infrastructure. Now consider what Portland was in the 1850s, a frontier city, population under 1,000, rough wooden structures, muddy streets, the kind of place where sophisticated underground infrastructure would be both technically challenging and economically inexplicable. Yet these tunnels show engineering sophistication comparable to established East Coast cities with decades more development and significantly larger populations. How did a frontier settlement acquire the expertise, funding, and labor to build miles of underground passages? The official explanation points to flooding. Portland sits at the confluence of the Willamette and Columbia rivers, prone to seasonal high water. The tunnels supposedly allowed commerce to continue underground when surface streets became impassable. But examine the tunnel layout and this explanation collapses. Many passages run parallel to the waterfront at elevations that would flood just as readily as surface streets. Others extend inland to areas that never experienced significant flooding. The network doesn't follow a pattern designed to avoid water. It follows something else entirely. And here's what struck me most about the architectural evidence. The tunnel sections built in the 1850s are indistinguishable from sections supposedly added in the 1870s and 1880s. Same brick patterns. Same mortar composition. Same construction techniques. As if the entire network was built simultaneously according to a unified plan, not piecemeal over decades by different builders for different purposes. I talked to a structural engineer who examined exposed tunnel sections during a 1990s renovation project. He described finding construction methods that shouldn't exist in 1850s frontier architecture. Precision brickwork. Advanced drainage integration. Foundation techniques typically associated with major European cities, not Pacific Northwest settlements. When he mentioned these anomalies in his report, he was told to focus on structural integrity assessment only, that historical questions weren't within his scope of work. The tunnels run deep, much deeper than necessary for basement storage or flood avoidance. Some sections descend 20 to 25 feet below current street level. But Portland's street grade has risen significantly since the 1850s due to repeated fills and regrading, which means these passages were originally even deeper, excavated to levels that suggest they might have been connecting to something already existing rather than being the original construction. There are chambers, not just passages but finished rooms, some quite large. A space discovered beneath the Merchant Hotel during renovations measured approximately 40 by 60 feet with a 12-foot ceiling. Brick walls, stone floor, evidence of gas lighting installations. The hotel was built in 1858. Why would a modest frontier hotel need a chamber of that size and sophistication beneath it? What was its intended purpose? Workers who've accessed restricted tunnel sections describe discovering older construction beneath newer work. Walls that appear to be 1860s brickwork, but when damaged or removed, reveal stone foundations underneath showing different construction techniques. Older mortar, weathering patterns suggesting much greater age. As if the 1850s builders weren't creating these tunnels but renovating and connecting pre-existing underground spaces. Now, layer in the missing records. Portland had a fire in 1872 that destroyed much of downtown. The official story is that it consumed city planning documents, construction permits, and property records from the city's early decades. Convenient, but records from other Pacific Northwest cities that experienced similar fires show better documentation survival. Seattle's records largely survived its 1889 fire. San Francisco maintained archives despite multiple disasters. Why did Portland lose so much? And what survived is suspicious. The post-1872 records emphasizing Shanghaiing and criminal use of tunnels are extensive. Newspaper accounts, police reports, legal proceedings, all carefully preserved. But pre-1872 documentation about tunnel construction and intended purpose is virtually non-existent. As if someone decided what version of history would be remembered and what would be lost. The Shanghaiing narrative itself deserves scrutiny. It's absolutely true that the practice occurred in Portland and other Pacific ports. Sailors were drugged, kidnapped, and forcibly recruited. But was that really the primary function of an elaborate underground network built decades earlier? Or was it a convenient explanation that obscured the tunnel's original purpose? Consider the timing. The Shanghaiing story becomes prominent in the 1880s and 1890s, exactly when questions about Portland's underground infrastructure would naturally arise as the city expanded and construction projects kept encountering these passages. Give them a scandalous criminal origin story and nobody asks deeper questions about sophisticated frontier engineering that shouldn't exist. There's another element. Indigenous accounts from the region reference underground spaces predating European settlement. Tribal oral histories mention old places beneath the earth, near the river confluence. Early trappers and explorers make occasional references to encountering stone structures or cleared subterranean areas. These accounts are dismissed as misidentifications of natural caves or exaggerations. But what if they were accurate? What if Portland's founders discovered existing underground infrastructure and simply connected and repurposed it? The geometry of the tunnel network supports this possibility. The layout doesn't follow the grid pattern of Portland's planned streets. Instead, it creates its own geometric design that predates the city's surface organization, as if the tunnels were already there and the city was built above and around them, with connections added to access pre-existing passages. I found a geological survey from 1849, before Portland's official incorporation. The surveyor notes evidence of prior excavation in areas that would later become downtown. He recommends further investigation. No follow-up survey was ever conducted, or, if it was, the records haven't survived. Or they've been carefully filed where researchers won't find them. Property ownership patterns add another layer of mystery. Many buildings with tunnel access were owned by the same small group of individuals in the 1850s and 1860s. These weren't random property owners, but specific families and business interests that seemed to control access to the underground network. Why would tunnel access be so carefully managed if these were just commercial basements or later criminal additions? Access to the tunnels has been progressively restricted over the decades. Sections that were open for tours in the 1970s are now sealed. Areas that historians could explore in the 1980s require special permits today. The reasons given are safety, structural integrity, liability concerns. But the pattern is systematic closure, careful management of what can be seen and documented, control over the narrative about what these spaces were and why they exist. I tried to get permission to survey blocked sections beneath several downtown buildings. The applications went through multiple bureaucratic layers before being denied for reasons that kept changing. First, it was safety, then property owner concerns, then insurance liability, finally just not appropriate for independent research. What's in those sealed sections that can't be photographed or measured? Modern ground-penetrating radar surveys show the tunnel network extends far beyond publicly acknowledged areas. Passages run beneath the Willamette River itself, connecting downtown to areas on the East Bank. That's not Shanghaiing infrastructure. That's major engineering requiring resources and expertise far beyond what Portland supposedly possessed in the 1850s. Who built passages under a river in a frontier settlement? And why? The official tours show tourists carefully selected sections. Always the same routes. Always the same stories. Guides point to iron rings in walls, claiming they held prisoners. They show brick alcoves, calling them holding cells. They describe trapdoors and bars where victims were dropped into the tunnels. But examine these features architecturally, and they tell different stories. The iron rings match 19th century cargo securing hardware, not restraints. The alcoves are storage niches standard in commercial basements. The supposed trapdoors are coal chutes and service access points common in period construction. The Shanghaiing happened. Real people suffered real abductions. But using those crimes to explain an entire underground infrastructure system is like explaining a highway network by saying it was built for bank robberies. The explanation uses dramatic crime to obscure questions about original purpose and scale. There are photographs. Historical images from the 1860s and 1870s showing Portland's downtown under construction. Look closely at basement excavations visible in these photos. They're not digging, they're clearing, removing earth and debris from spaces that appear to already exist. The construction looks like access and renovation rather than original creation. Workers who've done foundation repair in old downtown buildings describe encountering walls that shouldn't be there, structural elements at depths that don't match building plans, passages that dead-end at filled doorways, suggesting they once continued further but have been deliberately blocked. One crew reported breaking through a basement wall during a renovation and finding a finished corridor that appeared on no modern surveys. They were ordered to seal it immediately, not map it, not document it, just close the breach and continue their assigned work. This pattern repeats across multiple cities. Seattle has similar underground passages officially attributed to regrading and fire recovery. San Francisco's Chinatown tunnels are explained as immigrant community spaces. Victoria, in British Columbia, has basement networks called merchant storage. Every Pacific port of significant age has elaborate underground infrastructure with official explanations that avoid deeper questions about origin and purpose, and they all date to the same period, the 1850s and 1860s, the same decades when these frontier settlements were supposedly just establishing themselves. Yet, they all built sophisticated underground networks requiring expertise, resources, and planning that seems incongruous with their official development histories. What if the pattern isn't coincidence? What if Pacific coastal cities were deliberately established at locations with existing underground infrastructure? What if the tunnels were already there, and the settlements grew around access points to pre-existing networks? The indigenous accounts support this possibility. Multiple tribal histories reference the region's sacred underground spaces, places of gathering and ceremony predating European contact. Early missionaries mention discovering pagan temples in caves near river confluences. French trappers describe finding evidence of prior occupation in subterranean spaces. These accounts are dismissed as cultural misunderstandings or religious prejudices coloring observations of natural features. But what if they were accurate? What if a sophisticated civilization predating recorded history built extensive underground infrastructure in the Pacific Northwest, and European settlers discovered and repurposed it, creating false historical narratives to explain what they found, rather than acknowledge they inherited advanced construction they didn't create and couldn't replicate? The construction techniques support this theory. The oldest tunnel sections show engineering sophistication that shouldn't exist in 1850s frontier work. Stone cutting precision, drainage integration, acoustic properties suggesting intentional design for sound management. These aren't features added by builders focused on quick commercial basements. They're characteristics of architecture designed for permanent human occupancy at scale. Portland's establishment itself raises questions. Why did settlers choose this specific location? The confluence was important for river navigation, certainly, but multiple locations offered similar advantages with better natural harbors. What made this particular spot worth the investment of establishing a major settlement? Was it the existing underground infrastructure? The timeline of Portland's growth is unusual. Most frontier cities develop gradually. Portland exploded from virtually nothing to significant regional center within a decade. That kind of growth requires infrastructure, resources, and capital investment that typically take much longer to accumulate. Unless the infrastructure was already there, waiting to be accessed and utilized. I keep returning to the sealed sections. Miles of passages that exist but can't be explored. Chambers mentioned in century-old records that can't be located on modern surveys. Areas that ground-penetrating radar shows are there, but that officials claim are inaccessible or unstable or simply deny exist at all. What's down there? What evidence of original construction and purpose has been carefully isolated from public knowledge? What do these tunnels connect that we're not supposed to discover? And why does a frontier city's basement passages require such systematic management and control? The Shanghaiing story is true enough to be believed and scandalous enough to satisfy curiosity. It's the perfect cover narrative. It explains the tunnels while preventing deeper investigation. It acknowledges their existence while obscuring their origin. It gives them a historical purpose that fits our expectations of 19th century Pacific port cities without requiring us to question how such infrastructure came to exist in the first place. But the evidence is there for anyone willing to look. The construction dates that predate the supposed purpose. The engineering sophistication that exceeds the settlement's capabilities. The geometric layout that ignores surface planning. The systematic closure and restriction of access. The missing records and controlled narratives. The pattern connecting multiple cities. The indigenous accounts of pre-existing underground spaces. Portland's Shanghai tunnels aren't what we've been told. They're not criminal infrastructure built for human trafficking. They're something older, more sophisticated, more extensively planned. They're evidence of advanced construction in a time and place that shouldn't have had the capability for such engineering. They're remnants of something built before the city, repurposed and explained away with convenient criminal histories that prevent uncomfortable questions about who built them, when, and why. The tunnels remember, even if the records don't. The stone holds, evidence even if the archives have been carefully edited. The passages continue beneath our feet, most of them sealed, all of them raising questions we've collectively agreed not to ask. Questions about Portland's real foundations, about what existed before the city, about whose old-world basements we inherited and repurposed, and then blamed on Shanghaiers to avoid acknowledging we don't actually know who built the infrastructure our city stands above.